One of the most common ways of using remote access or facilitating a remote connection is to use remote desktop. First of all, you've got to enable remote desktop before you can use it. Open up the System Properties dialog and click the Remote tab, and then enable Allow Remote Connections to this computer. You can specify the sub-option here, Allow Connections only from computers running remote desktop with NLA, which is recommended. That means more recent versions of Windows and it makes it more secure. You can then specify, by clicking Select Users, which particular users have access. The locally signed in user already has access, that's the local administrator in this instance, but thereafter you can add anybody else. It's probably a good idea to use groups. So create a group that has remote access and then grant users membership of that group. To establish a remote desktop connection, you can use the Remote Desktop Connection tool or run mstsc.exe from the Start search box. And then, as you can see here, you can specify the name of the computer that you want to connect to and then a username, and specify that you want to save credentials. You can also choose to save the connection details, as you can see at the bottom under Connection Settings. The configurable remote desktop connection options include, on the General page, the details I've just outlined. The Display page allows you to specify how you'll view the information, what size, what resolution, how much detail. Again, on a slower link you might want to reduce the resolution and detail. How local resources are going to be impacted by the connection. So, for example, what happens with the clipboard and what happens with remote printers and with remote audio. So if a noise is made at the remote computer, do you want to hear it locally? That sort of thing. The overall experience is determined by your speed of connection, and you can control that on the Experience tab. And then on the Advanced tab, there are a number of options that allow you to configure security, behavior, and prompting. We'll look at all of these in the demonstration shortly. You can configure remote desktop using group policy objects. To do so, open the appropriate group policy object for editing and navigate to Computer Configuration, Policies, Administrative Templates, Windows Components, Remote Desktop Services, and then configure the following options. In the Remote Desktop Connection Client folder, choose Do Not Allow Passwords to be Saved. In the same folder, choose Prompt for Credentials on the client computer. In the Remote Desktop Session Host folder, /Connections, choose Allow users to connect remotely by using Remote Desktop Services. In the Remote Desktop Session Host folder, choose Device and Resource Redirection, so that controls things like the audio and the printers. In the same folder, under the Security subfolder, choose Set Client Connection Encryption Level, and choose Session Time Limits to control how long someone can be connected to. A security feature you can consider is Restricted Admin Mode for RDP. This prevents transmissions of reusable credentials to the remote system to which you connect with RDP. It also prevents these credentials from being harvested during the initial connection process if the remote server has been compromised. To enable Restricted Admin Mode, on the remote host you must edit the registry. Go to HKLM, System, Current Control Set, Control, LSA, and then add a new dword value named Disable Restricted Admin. Set the value of that to 0. Then, to use Remote Desktop in Restricted Admin Mode, initialize the Remote Desktop program with the /Restricted Admin switch. You can also use Remote Credential Guard to help secure remote desktop connections. Remote Credential Guard helps you protect your credentials over a remote desktop connection by redirecting Kerberos requests back to the device that's requesting the connection. It provides for a single sign-on experience for remote desktop sessions. There are, however, a number of requirements. The remote desktop client must be running at least Windows 10 version 1703 to be able to supply credentials. Be running at least Windows 10 version 1607 or Windows Server 2016 to use the user's signed-in credentials. Be running the Remote Desktop Classic Windows application. Be using Kerberos authentication to connect to the remote host. In addition, the Remote Desktop Remote Host must be running at least Windows 10 version 1607 or Windows Server 2016. Allow restricted admin connections. Allow the client's domain user to access remote desktop connections. Allow delegation of non-exportable credentials. To enable Remote Credential Guard, you must edit the registry on the remote host. Enable Windows Defender Remote Credential Guard by navigating to HKLM, System, Current Control Set, Control LSA, and adding the Disable Restricted Admin dword value. Set that value to 0. On Windows 10 version 17.03 or more recent, you can enable Remote Credential Guard on the client device either by using the mstsc.exe/remote guard command line when you run Remote Desktop, or with Group Policy. Open the local Group Policy Management Editor, navigate to Computer Configuration, Administrative Templates, System, Credentials Delegation, and double-click the Restrict Delegation of Credentials to Remote Servers value. And then choose either Windows Defender Remote Credential Guard or Require Windows Defender Remote Credential Guard. Okay, so in the demonstration we'll see how to enable Remote Desktop, configure Remote Desktop Session, and then establish a Remote Desktop Session. To enable Remote Desktop, I'm going to open up the properties of this PC and click on Remote Settings, and then as you see here I can choose an option for Remote Desktop. Don't allow remote connections to the computer, which is default. Allow remote connections, but allow connections only from computers running Remote Desktop with network level authentication. That's from Windows Vista onwards, I think. And then I can specify particularly which users have that capability. Andrew, which is me, who I'm signed in as on this local computer, already has access, and then I can click Add and specify user accounts from the local security authority. I can also, if this computer is a member of a domain, add user accounts from the domain. Best way to do this is through group membership. So that's fine. I've now allowed remote connections. It's also a good idea to check the Windows Firewall configuration as well. And then again, allow an app or feature through the firewall. If I scroll down to R, I've got Remote Desktop enabled. You'll see that it's enabled on private and public. I might want to change that. Having enabled Remote Desktop, I then need to open up the Remote Desktop program and configure it. You can find that in Windows Accessories, Remote Desktop Connection, or you can just click Start and type MSTSC, and you'll see it in the Remote Desktop. See it listed in the Start menu under Remote Desktop Connection. Open that, and I'm going to show more detail. And then I enter the computer name that I want to connect to, or its IP address. So if I want to connect to a remote computer, and then the username to connect to that remote computer. And then allow me to save credentials if I want to do that. And then that may be enough to connect. But I may also want to configure the display properties. So I can choose to use the full screen, or I can specify some other resolution. As you'll appreciate, I'm in a demonstration environment here, so my screen size is actually limited here to 1280 by 720, so that's not a particularly large expanse of screen space. So I'm going to choose 800 by 600 to connect. I can choose the color depth, and obviously the higher the quality, then the more data is shifted across the link, and the potentially slower things run. But realistically, Remote Desktop doesn't impose a great load on a remote connection. How do I want local resources to work? So configure remote audio settings. So when something happens that generates a sound at the remote end, do I want to hear it here? Do I want to hear it there? Or do I not want to hear it at all? If I'm recording audio, do I want to record it from this computer or not at all? Keyboard options. So you can see that when you run certain keyboard combinations, they'll do something. So Alt-Tab and Control-Alt-Delete and so forth. What will happen when I use those keyboard functions? Will they control the remote session or the local computer? Down here I've got local devices and resources, so when I want to access printers, choose the devices and resources that you want to use in your remote session. I want to use the remote printers, I want to use the remote clipboard, and there are some more options that you can configure here in terms of disk drives and so on and so on. If I've got a fairly low speed connection, then I might want to configure that here, and that dials everything down in terms of the features and what you see in the way that Windows displays animations and visual styles and so forth are reduced in quality so that we use up less bandwidth. These days that's not a tremendous concern with even high-speed home broadband links. On the advanced page you can configure server authentication. When you connect to a server, that just means the remote end. If there is an issue with security, so for example the certificate that's used by the server at the remote end to identify itself has a date problem or a name problem or something, then do you want to know about that? So you can say, yes, warn me about it. Or you can say, I don't want to know about it, but just don't connect, and come up with an error message. Or connect and I don't even care. So it depends, I suppose, on what you're connecting to. If you're connecting to an internal server that you're managing, then it probably doesn't matter. If you're connecting to an external type resource, then it possibly does matter, because you need to know if you're connecting to the server that you think you're connecting to. So when I'm happy, I can click on General tab here and then click Connect. If all of these settings work for me, I can then save this as an RDP file for later use, and I can then add that to my Start menu as a shortcut if I want. So to actually connect, just click Connect. And I need to specify a password. That's because it's the same account on several different machines, but with a different password. And then click OK. So we've asked it to warn us, and it's telling us here, the remote computer could not be authenticated due to problems with its certificate. It may be unsafe to proceed. The name in the certificate of the remote computer is Scribbler2. The certificate is not from a trusted certifying authority. That's fine. It's a self-certified certificate at the remote end, but it's actually my other laptop that I'm connecting to, so that's perfectly acceptable. If I was a bit concerned about it, I could view the certificate, and you can see that it's not particularly exciting there, but it would tell us more if it was issued from an external authority. So I'm going to say I want to connect anyway. And there we can now see a remote desktop connection to the other machine, and it's fully functional. I can do everything that I want. And one of the advantages of remote desktop is it allows me to perform management on any device without needing to install the remote server administration tools locally. So if I want to manage a server, I establish a remote desktop connection to it and then use the built-in server tools on the server. Generally, it's a maxim that says never go to a server and perform management interactively with it when you can perform the same management task remotely. So remote desktop seems to be a bit of a go-to protocol for me when I want to perform management. When I'm happy with the session, or I'm finished doing what I need to do, I can close it down. And then next time I open up MSTSC, you can see that it's retained all of the information that I configured previously, and I can save that or save it as and give it a name. Let's call it Scribbler or something like that. Scribbler2, and save it to the desktop, and then there it is. So next time I want to establish a connection to Scribbler2, I can simply double click the shortcut. So in the demonstration you saw how to enable and configure remote desktop, and then how to establish a remote desktop session. Broadband tethering was introduced in Windows 8.1 and enables users to share their own internet connection with others by enabling the device to function as a wireless hotspot. Similarly, users can connect to other users' shared personal hotspots provided they have required credentials. You configure broadband tethering through the Settings app as shown here.